Please welcome to the stage Lisa Mitchell, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships, and Angela Clayton, President and CEO of Infrastructure Ontario.
Good morning.
Good morning. I warned you he'd be a tough act to follow.
I know, this feels a little overwhelming, guys. I've been around government a long time. I'm an Ottawa resident and I come from a public sector background. And huge congratulations to you and the team for obviously having built such a great relationship with the government. It is a very special thing when you are an arm's length organization, but obviously very clearly have the confidence of the government that you're working with. So huge congratulations. But also happy anniversary.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
20
you.
years. Very
20
exciting.
years.
Very exciting. I mean, I would love to get your perspective, because you've been in the industry a long time. This is a newer role for you, but I know we
haven't aged a day.
Yeah, that's right. We're spring chickens. But I'd love to get sort of your perspective on IO's sort of trajectory over the the 20 years. You guys are absolutely recognized as a force in the global industry in terms of not only having a significant pipeline of projects, but thinking innovatively. And I think the Premier spoke about that as well too. What do you think, reflecting back on 20 years, have been some of the defining achievements or turning points in IO's history?
I love this question, and I thought about it for a while. There is so much that has happened in the last 20 years. When you look at the entire industry, IO as an organization, I think we could probably spend about half an hour trading stories back and forth. But I think I was able to boil it down to three things I want to talk about. First is impact. Mm-hmm. When you think about the impact that this entire room, this industry has had on this province over the last 20 years, it's remarkable. So 140 projects worth over $150 billion. But when you boil that down to the impact that has had on the people of Ontario, let me just give you some numbers. So that's 56 new hospitals, 15 new justice facilities, over 100 kilometers of new roads, which includes the 407 extension, which I take all the time, which saves me so much time, 80 kilometers of new transit, and then just to throw it in there, high-speed internet for 5,000 residents that didn't have access before. Like, that is the work of a world-class agency. And there's a lot to be proud of there. Yeah. I think, I can't think of another public sector organization that has had that type of impact over the last 20 years. So we are super, super proud of the impact. The second thing has to be the people. Mm-hmm. We attract amazing people. It's not easy to work for the public sector. It's not easy to work for government. So these are people who are inspired by their civic duty and open to the challenge to work on the portfolio. And this industry is actually populated with former employees from Infrastructure Ontario. I'm just going to do a little bit of a spontaneous poll. If you have been employed by Infrastructure Ontario in the last 20 years, raise your hand. Just curious. Okay, I thought it would be about 10-20%, so yeah. Not too bad. Our success is 100% attributable to our people. Our people are our only asset, and ultimately, they are the ones that have helped us deliver. We're very proud of our track record too, our on time, on budget performance. So 91% on budget, 68% on time. And we've had this conversation. I think it's very unfortunate that the 10% of projects that get into trouble, they happen to fail in a very spectacular and high profile way, and it becomes a big distraction for us as an industry. So I think it's important we don't lose sight of the success that we've had. Yeah. Last thing I'm gonna say in terms of last 20 years, it's actually remarkable how much has changed. So when you think about the first pipeline that IO, when we were first created, it was to work on 6 hospital projects. 6 hospital projects. So over the past 20 years, we have built pretty much every type of asset, with the exception of housing. We haven't gone into housing and we haven't gone into energy, but pretty much everything else we've gotten involved in. So that's everything from the venues for the Pan Am Games. We did a series of rapid build facilities during the pandemic. As the Premier mentioned, we're working on Ontario Place, which is a really cool and exciting project. And we predominantly use the P3 model for the first 15 years of our operation. About 5 years ago, we started to see some pretty significant shifts in the market. And I know we're going to talk about models. And, we saw the market a little bit less willing to take risk, shifts in terms of the number of bidders showing up on P3 projects. And at the same time, our projects were getting bigger and more complex. And ultimately, that prompted us to look at a different way of doing things. So that prompted a series of new models, diversification in terms of how we're delivering the projects, but also starting to think smarter about what we're building and how we're building it. And then the last thing I'll say is, like, the entire lexicon around infrastructure has changed. I was thinking about this too. Like, if we were to jump into the Wayback Machine and go back 20 years, we would hear AFP, we would hear value for money, and we would hear template. Those would probably be the three most commonly used terms. And today we're talking about collaboration, we're talking about nation building, we're talking about breaking down regulatory barriers. Like, that entire conversation has shifted so much in 20 years. So I actually feel great about the last 20 years. It certainly hasn't come without its own bumps along the way, but overall, I think we have done remarkable work for the people of Ontario.
I think the numbers, speak for themselves in terms of projects. I mean, it's a significant pipeline you've delivered. On your point about the people, though, I think, it's fascinating, the amount of, people you talk to that, introduce themselves, they've done one thing, but they spent time at I.O. It's a bit of there's a bit of a legacy that's built within the industry that way as well, that they can spread the knowledge. I also think it's fascinating, too. We have an industry where you can flip from the public to the private sector so easily and translate that.
I loved it so much I went back twice, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. I think just to pick up on your last point about sort of how things have changed over time, and I think the Premier, made comments about the fact that he really likes working with you because you think outside the box. Things have changed. The market has shifted. You guys still have a fantastic pipeline of projects. The regular, talking to the industry, people love the market updates. They can plan, they know what's coming. I think that's a huge benefit to the way you guys do business. But as things shift, and we've talked a lot about this, and the conversation is ongoing with the industry about sort of the models and the approaches, new asset classes. You mentioned energy and housing. So there's a lot of things to think about. So how do you guys kind of look at balancing the commitment to sort of P3s, whether it be the model or the concept, with, adapting new and innovative ways of doing things, new models that are being introduced, and, and still gaining sort of that traction with the market?
Yeah. I think the right place to start is what hasn't changed. And what hasn't changed is government's fundamental objectives in terms of what we're trying to get out when we build infrastructure. And these principles really haven't changed over time. So first and foremost, we are looking to transfer risk to the party best able to manage it. Typically, that tends to be fixed price risk, and we know increasingly that's been challenging on larger projects. But we also, want to break down some of the regulatory barriers, and the Premier talked about that a little bit. The second thing is schedule and cost certainty. Right? The whole reason why I.O. was created as an organization was to deal with underperformance from CM hospital projects that ran into trouble 20 years ago, right? So we want to learn from history, and David Frum talked about that quite a bit yesterday, and make sure we don't make the same mistakes of the past. Ultimately, we also need to make sure we're delivering value for taxpayers, right? So what we're doing, is it getting the best outcome for taxpayers? And so those fundamental principles still hold true. And I've said this before, I'll say it again, I personally believe the P3 model is the best model to help us deliver on those principles. But the reality that we've been running into again and again, as our projects get bigger and more complex, there is less competition, and that's because the market's less willing to take on some of the risks associated with P3. And so that is really driving us into this place of innovation. And so you see on the pipeline now, there's a diversity of models that we're deploying. And if you take the risk spectrum, it is everything from alliance, right, which would be greatest risk transfer, to we're still doing DBFMs, so full risk transfer on P3s. And the great thing about doing that is it's going to give us the spectrum to be able to compare results and manage performance. accordingly. You know, when I think about P3s and my ask to this room and to the industry, those of you that continue to advocate for the use of P3s, I'd say there's 3 things that would really make a difference. First is show up and bid, right? If you're advocating for the use of the model, when we put a project out there, just show up and bid. And if the risks that we're looking to transfer aren't palatable, come and have that conversation with us. We're very open to having that conversation. The second thing is historically, and I know I'm going to take a lot of heat for this, but we have not seen lenders and equity step up in a meaningful way when projects get into trouble. And we're really looking for those partners to help us out so that we're not having to mend fences between broken consortia or having to inject capital into projects because of cash flow problems. And that's where we're finding ourselves right now. And then the third thing I'd say is the value proposition for long-term maintenance and life cycle is indisputable. You walk through a P3 asset that's 10, 15 years into operations compared to a project that was built 15 years ago, and no offense to the public sector, but they're dealing with different pressures. Those 2 assets are maintained in a very different way, and you can tell it as soon as you walk through the door. So that's my ask to this industry. Bid, get the lenders and equity to help us out a bit more, and then for those of you that are in the operating space, really, really demonstrate and push the value proposition associated with long-term life cycle. Just quickly, sorry, Lisa, I got on a bit of a tangent, but just we've learned a few things along the way that and I feel like I've been saying this message for the last couple of years now. First and foremost, we've learned that size matters probably more than model when it comes to participation. And we are super aware of that and trying to figure out how do we take these mega projects and package them in a way that's more palatable for the market. I'll also say we've had mixed results on the collaborative process. So with the collaborative process, we were hoping to get a few things. One is more input and more dialogue around risk transfer, but also fundamentally different ways to deliver projects. So innovation on design, innovation on construction means and methods. And we haven't quite got there yet. And then the trade-off has been not having that competitive environment to drive the value. So, we're still learning as we're going through the progressives, and they can work, and we can see that, but there's definitely still some gaps there.
I think, your point, and I think your pitch to the audience, come talk to us. I say this often, and where we started in this journey 30 years ago with P3s, the structure of the deals, the type, the way the projects looked, very different than where we are now. We are an industry that has shown that we can adapt and evolve, but it requires that conversation, like that discussion. So I think it's great that you guys are continuously open to having that dialogue. It dovetails in really quite nicely with some of the policy work that we're looking at as well too, in terms of expanding the umbrella and evolving the model. So I very much echo Angela's comments in terms of encouraging that dialogue. And I think your points about the O&M, I think are key as well too. I think we need to get better at telling those stories, because we hear the anecdotal, the hospital anecdote, the road anecdote about, if you look at the 2 of them, the traditional versus the P3 in terms of that life cycling. I think we need to definitely get better, especially as we get into the handback onslaught that we're gonna see over the next few years. I mean, I think you've talked a lot about sort of the context. Things have changed over 20 years, and the Premier just spoke as well too. And I'd kind of like to pick up on some of his views. The current sort of domestic policy environment that we're living in terms of dealing with our partner to the south, and are looking for new trading partners, and sort of a very internal focus on Canada and growing our own economy. So, there's been over the years, but now a very, very central focus on sort of domestic content, local participation. We've got Buy Canada, Buy Ontario. Now, all of that, those types of policies and things don't operate in silos, right? There's a broader impact. So how are you at IO navigating these pressures and thinking through the delivery of, a very extensive pipeline in that context?
Yeah, it's probably the biggest policy question that's consuming us right now in terms of, the trade and tariff environment, the impact it has on our pipeline. And I will say, we have made a very intentional and conscious effort to engage the market in a different way for the last year, both in terms of the macro environment that we're operating in and specific conversations on specific projects as we're contemplating changes to models. So just on that engagement, like hopefully those in this room feel that the doors are open and we're open to those conversations. So because of that, we've actually gotten some really, really good feedback and input when it comes to tariff and trade. Obviously, the market is not willing to take uncertainty associated with certain macroeconomic risks, things like tariffs, hyperinflation, and we've put in mechanisms within our contracts to protect against that risk, because the last thing we want is our bids coming in with unknown, uncertain risk priced into them, because that's just driving the cost up overall. But there are a few things that are directly impacting our projects right now. So first and foremost, since March of this year, there has been in place a Ontario government policy. It's the procurement restriction policy that puts a restriction in place in terms of our ability to do work with certain firms that don't meet this definition. That's been in place since March 2025. And we've been operating under that framework. Concurrently, we're also having conversations with political staff. Now, IO doesn't set policy. That is not our role. We're an implementation agency. But often we do give advice to government when it comes to understanding the impacts of certain policy decisions that are being contemplated. And so in this case, the government is looking for ways to further incentivize the use of domestic products. Mm-hmm. And if you were to draw those concentric circles, it's Ontario, Canada, international, US paying tariffs. How do we incentivize that behavior without necessarily directly subsidizing some of these industries? Because David Frum made a brilliant point yesterday about we've been here before, we've done this, the way we approached it 40 years ago didn't work out the way we thought it would. How do we learn from those mistakes? The good news is that almost all of our labor and many of our products on our projects right now are sourced domestically. So that's the good news. Most of the labor is coming in. Majority of the materials that are being used either are currently being sourced domestically or they're available to be sourced domestically. And we know from the market that there are some components that are more challenging: structural steel, miscellaneous metals, mechanical, electrical equipment, and elevators, for example, where we don't have great domestic capacity to be able to serve the needs of the projects. But at the end of the day, and David Frum said this yesterday, protectionism is a cost, right? There are implications of implementing a policy like this. And so our role is to protect, to make sure that if we're going to do this, there aren't material delays or increased costs as a result of it, and how do we support the industry? We're also super sensitive to the fact that we're already dealing with a constrained environment. We know there's constraints on skilled trades and labor. We know that there's already constraints on certain aggregates and certain raw materials that are leading to downstream impacts. So we're trying to look at all the different moving pieces and weave it together and help government come up with a policy that gets us the right outcome for the Ontario company, which is buying and building materials made in Ontario and made in Canada without sacrificing the need to continue building and not overpaying at the end of the day.
Do you think, the Buy Canada policy, it's been clear from the federal government that it's going to apply to federal procurements and then filter down to, projects that are funded by the federal government, so imposing sort of those kind of qualifications on provinces, territories, municipalities, as well too.
Yeah.
It's a bit uneven at the provincial level in terms of the territorial level as to how people are viewing that. So have you thought about sort of, with such a big build agenda, so many projects that are going to be coming to market, how that might affect sort of Ontario's competitiveness in a very big push for building?
I can say IO hasn't quite looked at that. I know economic development and the kind of bigger picture are looking at that. The feds have been a great partner. We've been collaborating with them. They've shared their policies with us. So we've been making sure that there's alignment there. I know, the Protect Ontario team that's working on this policy is trying to come up with a policy that could be applied much more broadly than just infrastructure projects and assessing. So, you know, we see a tiny, tiny sliver of what's being contemplated. There is a team of experts that's looking at the bigger and broader implications, you know, and modeling out what the impacts are on GDP and other things. That's way beyond my pay band and my scope of responsibility. But you know, we were having this conversation for people who are interested in, you know, all the government policy wonks. Like this is really exciting and cool stuff. And he's here somewhere. I got one of them that works very closely with me, Jeff Parker. And you know, this is just something that they're really complex policy decisions that have so many potential implications. It's, you know, you want to make sure you get the right outcome without completely upsetting the apple cart. And we'll talk a little bit too about the increased need for collaboration and coordination between the provinces and the feds right now, just in light of all the work that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's and I think that's a key component. I think it came up in the panel yesterday as well too, in terms of that coordinating effort. But, you know, looking forward, it's been 20 years. You know, what does the next 20 years look like?
Are we still going to be here 20 years from now, sitting up on this stage?
Well, I don't know if we'll be up on this stage, but yeah, I mean, we're spring chickens. We still got a lot of time left. You know, what does the next chapter look like? You know, what you guys have over the history really kind of been known to set standards in this country, and so, you know, what are the things you're thinking about sort of for the next phase, the next chapter, and you know, what can we all look for?
Yeah, I think the future's bright for IO and infrastructure in general. We still have a lot to build. So the Premier mentioned, like, they are all in on the infrastructure agenda. Pipeline went out yesterday, has 25 projects either in procurement or approved to proceed to procurement. We got another 20 in planning. So pipeline is super, super strong. There's going to continue to be lots of infrastructure work for the foreseeable future, which is really, really exciting for us. I think it's also true, and he used this term and we use it a lot, like, it is not business as usual. Mm-hmm. We are going through a period of fundamental transformation, and I use the term transformation a lot around the halls at IO, and I use it both in terms of internal transformation, we are changing as an organization, and external transformation. We are changing the way that we deliver projects, and we need to do that at a fundamental level. So internally, we're going through a bit of a reorganization, and our goal is to build a leaner organization that has different skill sets. Mm-hmm. So skill sets and experience and competencies that are better aligned to the models that we're executing. So collaboration, innovation, those types of things. So internally, we are changing as an organization to keep up with the models and our approaches as they evolve. Externally, I think just looking at fundamentally different ways to deliver projects. We talk about segmentation, we talk about standardization, we're going to talk about innovation, you know, and I just want to debunk this misconception that delivery models are going to drive cost savings or that they fundamentally change the way infrastructure is delivered. Delivery models, it's a procurement tool. It's a contracting tool to purchase something. But we need to invest in innovation. Because the reality is the productivity in the construction sector has been stagnant or declining for the past, since 2009 was the data as far as we can see. And so I think fundamentally we need to look at changing the way that we're delivering projects and investing more in innovation. So we talk a lot about digital twins. We are all in on digital twins. We see lots of opportunity for the adoption of generative AI in terms of design work, estimating, scheduling, coordination on site. You know, you can go out and think about robotics and automation. Like, there's all these great technologies, new and emerging, that we just haven't fully embraced as an entire industry. And so I think there's a role for organizations like Infrastructure Ontario to lead in that space in a manner that is not prescriptive. We don't want to tell you this is how you need to invest in innovation, but we want to make sure that the incentive is there. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to be able to build quicker, and we want to be able to build cheaper. because that means we can build more, right? So if we can drive down our cost per square foot, our cost per kilometer, our schedule, and the sad reality is, even when you adjust for inflation, it costs more and takes longer to build now than it did 20 years ago. And I've had this conversation with a few people in the hallways, and they'll say, well, the safety has improved, and the buildings are more complex, and standards have changed. IPAC is very different now. Infection control is very different right now than what it was before. But the reality about the stagnant productivity, those are real numbers, right? And I think we collectively have an obligation as an industry to figure out how we can get more efficient at building. Because it's not like, if it costs less, we're going to build less. If we can get our cost of our projects down, we're going to build more projects, right? So it's better for all of us in the room as an industry. It's certainly better for us as taxpayers.
Technological advances, you and I might not have to be here in 20 years.
This is true.
Be some sort of avatar or something. Who knows? We'll find it. We'll find a way. I think it's exciting times. It's been quite the journey over 20 years, and I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff to come. But it really does sound like there's a very significant sort of shift in the thinking. In terms of really putting innovation and different ways of doing business at the top of the list for IO and your people, and I think that's a great sort of segue into the conversations we're going to have today. But I think it's a fantastic place to sort of see, we're not same old. There's lots of opportunity for us.
Yeah.
I really want to thank you for joining me today and having a bit of a conversation. I think it's very exciting times. Happy anniversary to you and to the team, and for all of you IO alum that are throughout the room. Really appreciate it, and we'll do this again another time. See how things have changed.
Great. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks.